Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to the Brickyard interview series. I'm Andrea Thompson, and today it is my pleasure to be chatting with Qurat Dar. Hi, Qurat.
Hi.
So I'll read your little bio here so everybody can get a little introduction to you. Qurat Dar, she, they, is the City of Mississauga's current Youth Poet Laureate and the 2020 Canadian Individual Poetry Slam National Champion. Her work has appeared in Canthius, Augur Magazine, and the Art Gallery of Mississauga, among other places. So, yeah, I'm really happy to be chatting with you today. I was checking out your work earlier, and it's beautiful. I love it. I'm a
Thank
fan.
you. Thank you.
So this is the last one of our series of interviews with artists who are involved with the Toronto-based series Hot Damn. It's a queer slam spoken word series, and you are on the Hot Damn Collective. Is that correct?
Yeah, so I was involved with the kind of like organizing group um since I guess like a year or two now.
How did that happen? How did you get hooked up with those folks?
So it's kind of funny and a little sad actually, because I didn't really go to a whole lot of the events while they were still in person.
Mm,
I think I went to one, it might have been like the 2019 finals. But I ended up featuring at one of the online slams, I think in maybe summer of 2020. And then I had already known the director, Robin, a little bit. We kind of had crossed paths a few times. And they kind of reached out and were like, "Oh, would you be interested in joining the team and helping?" And it was kind of good timing because I was already starting to kind of move away from competing in slam and more towards a role as like an organizer.
mm.
So I was like, yeah, and the rest is history, I guess. I've been part of the group since.
That's cool. Yeah, it's funny. It seems like it's a very common trajectory. It was one for me too. You start off in slam competing, and then you start getting into organizing. And for me, I don't know about you, but I'll be asking you. My style kind of changed. I started to expand a little bit. So yeah, and okay, so let me just start at the beginning. I really like to ask artists how they got into to poetry, spoken word, because I think, we really want a lot of young artists to be able to use this resource of Brickyard, and especially the interviews, to be like, how does this happen? I love spoken word, I love poetry. So what was your journey like? How did you get involved with the art?
Sure. So basically, it's kind of funny because growing up, I really loved reading and was a lot more interested in writing fiction. So I considered myself more of like a prose person.
Okay.
And that was kind of my lifelong dream was being an author and writing fiction. Um, and then in high school was kind of some of my first exposure to poetry, when we did a poetry unit in English, and I was like, oh, this is kind of interesting. But even then, kind of the writing poetry that I did was more kind of just journal entries. And that's, I guess, kind of where things started. And then in second year of my undergrad, I heard about a poetry slam, and I honestly I didn't really have any idea what it was. Didn't know what spoken word was. I was like, what is this thing? But it was really the idea that I could kind of share my writing in a performance space was really exciting.
Mm.
So I kind of just showed up, and my poem was not great, but I kind of just showed up and competed in this slam, and it was just it's just such an amazing experience to have that like audience interaction and hearing other people perform their poetry. And after that, I was kind of just like hooked, and I ended up later that year joining the like wildcard team at CFSW.
Mm.
Um, and then the year after, I think I went as like a storm poetess. I kind of just very quickly jumped into the deep end of spoken word a little bit.
Yeah.
Um, but that that largely, I feel like getting to compete in slam was a huge catalyst for me and actually really developing poetry and really like actually writing it for its own sake and not just as like this side thing, when my real interest was fiction. So that's kind of kind of my beginnings, I guess.
I love that though, because that I feel like you have a very you have your own voice, you have your own approach. So I love that you came to slam, the competitive performance poetry kind of forum, um, not with a previous expectation of, this is what you do, this is what it is. Okay, so I think this would be a great time for people to get to hear some of your work. Would you like to share a piece with us?
Sure. I'll read a poem called Fishmouth. Let me just pull this up. Okay. Fishmouth. They were small at first, a few months apart, rare enough that the silver flashes in the sink could be a trick of the light. Gleaming porcelain and saliva conspiring together, but it got worse. The day my grandmother died, I stood in the bathroom, felt it coming even before my tears, gagged as the small lump rose in my throat, flopping into my mouth, and spat it into the sink. A goldfish the size of a grape. Next came minnows and sardines. In no pattern, weeks of peace followed by 3 in one day, or one in the middle of the night, with no warning, no water breaking other than the tears in my eyes for my seizing throat. Stillborn, I hated and pitied them with equal measure until one lived, an anchovy that shuddered in my fingers until I found it a bowl in which to swim lazy circles. It got better. More came, but more lived, until I had bowls and vases and jugs with tiny lives circling in them. My mother joked that I must have swallowed the ocean, and it was just beginning to wriggle itself out, trying to find its way home. She told me Tansen could sing the fish out of the water, his voice was so beautiful. I didn't have the voice to sing. Maybe it had me, a reverse Jonah with a million captives all praying for their freedom. They started to go into the pond, the creek, in clandestine trips where I forced myself not to imagine the men with fishing poles downstream who would pick their carcasses clean. My lover had a smelt leap into his mouth and decided he didn't want a fish mouth, fish woman, if she didn't have the looks of a siren, didn't sing only of him. The fish didn't miss him, even if I did, in between coughing fits and river trips. Some of them were beautiful, koi and shibunkin that swam like dancers, iridescent as they found the water. Some I couldn't bring myself to part with until I had to, like the starfish I coughed up, no larger than a dime, that was born knowing it needed the ocean. As it disappeared into the tide, swept out away from me, I realized that the world was a mass of water, the blue, all thrumming with fish. Thank
Wow,
you.
that's gorgeous. That's gorgeous. Yeah, I dig it. I like your stuff. And I was just thinking like I'm going to be using that. I do some teaching around spoken word, and I'm like, that's like a masterclass study in extended metaphor there. And yeah, and bouncing around too with the whole like the birth imagery as well, with the water breaking and stillborn, and really gorgeous, and very nicely set up for my next question. Thank you for the segue. So something that really fascinates me is the way that a poet's fascination, or any kind of artist actually, how their fascinations in life intersect and feed into their art. So when I was checking out about your bio and your background today, found out that you're a very celebrated environmentalist. So you received the Lieutenant Governor Ontario. I'm going to say this because you didn't toot your own horn in the bio that will be below, but you received the Lieutenant Governor Ontario Heritage Award for Youth Achievement, and were named one of Canada's top 25 environmentalists under 25 by the Starfish in 2016. So in your work, we can see that, that influence of of nature and how that muse kind of shows up. One of the other things that I found out about you is that you're studying engineering at the University of Guelph, and looking at your work online, because there's some text of your work online. I found myself thinking about how is a poem engineered, and thinking about structure. And there's a real thoughtful approach you have to structure and line break. So I was wondering how those two worlds intersected, and if your engineering passion has fed into the art, and how, if it has.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I feel like a lot of times that tends to get such a, when people find out that I'm both like an engineering student and a poet, that tends to get a really broad range of reactions. With people being like, what? Um, but I feel like both of those practices and both of those parts of my life definitely do inform each other.
Mhm.
Um, even though even though people tend to kind of consider them as kind of very separate and siloed, and there's all these jokes about like, oh, poets can't do math and engineers can't write a paragraph. But I feel like there'll be times, for example, when I was doing my undergrad, where I would hear a specific concept from science or math that I was like, there's something very poetic about this.
Yeah.
Um, Something about this could really be drawn into a metaphor.
Mhm.
Um, and I feel like having that kind of background of I feel like both poetry and engineering are just like different lenses with which to understand the world, really. And having kind of like both those lenses allows me to sometimes kind of almost think in a more holistic way.
Mm.
Um, but there are definitely times where I feel like poetry, like as you're talking about, can definitely be considered an engineering of language,
Mhm.
and engineering and design in a lot of ways can be poetic.
Mhm.
Um, so I've kind of hit a point where I'm trying to consider them less distinct myself
Mm.
and kind of like see those overlaps.
Yeah.
Um, and something that's really cool. So at Guelph, so I'm doing my master's at Guelph now,
Okay.
and I've gotten to work with this really neat group called GEAR, the Guelph Institute for Environmental Research.
Okay.
And they do lots and lots of interdisciplinary work.
Mm.
And I've gotten to kind of join as like a bit of a part-time researcher, looking at the intersections between poetry and environmental research, which was
Perfect.
really exciting. Yeah.
That's perfect. So they created it and then you just stepped into it?
Yeah, so I actually,
Nice.
ironically, I had applied to another kind of like summer job with them,
Mm.
and they were like, "Oh, like we chose someone else for this, but we think you would be like
Yeah.
amazing to work with," and they kind of ended up tailoring a position to me almost.
Yeah, nice. Nice.
Yeah, which is really cool.
I think that's great. I mean, one of the things that I love about spoken word is seeing how people bring what they're passionate about. It's like bringing your whole self to the art, and yeah, you really embody that well. And it made me think about the poetry of engineering and the beauty of structure and construction. And so one of the other things that I was wondering about is it brought me to thinking about process. What is, you kind of hinted about that you maybe come across something in the world and you think about the poetry in it. But is there a typical kind of approach that you have to going from, you know, kind of no thought to a finished piece?
Um, yeah, so it's honestly it's a bit variable sometimes. Because there will be that rare occasion, which I wish it happened more, but sometimes I will just like sit down and a poem just like comes out, which is amazing, but honestly rare and it doesn't
A
happen as much
gift.
anymore either. Um, but I feel like something that's been happening for me more recently is kind of building poems piece by piece. So for example, I might have, for example, like that concept or image in my head that really sticks with me. Like for fish mouth, I don't know how it came to me, but I was like barfing up fish. That kind of just like stuck with me. And I was like, what can I do with this? And then I kind of keep revisiting that idea or image. Um, and often, this is kind of weird, but I guess often kind of like the meaning making of it comes after I've written a lot of it already. Like
Mm,
I'll write a poem and then be like, oh, this is what I was talking about, but I just didn't realize while I was writing the poem.
mm,
Um, but yeah, it can often be kind of an iterative process where I'll have that initial idea, I come back to it and look at it in a slightly different way and add to it a little bit. Um, and then I've also kind of done something where sometimes I'll do kind of a bit of a patchwork poem
mm,
where I'll pick up, like, if I just have like random free writes or journal entries, I'll pick up on specific lines that I really like and then try to thread them together into like their own narrative.
mm.
Um,
Yeah.
So yeah, those are kind of like a few different ways that it happens for me, I guess.
Yeah, that's cool. I like that idea too, and I've thought about that myself too, is of this you know, you don't really necessarily always know what you're writing until you're into the process. And I think it's a great thing to share because a lot of times, especially when we're new to something, and it's intimidating, it feels like we have to have things figured out. So I love that you sharing about that exploratory aspect of creating an art. Something else that I was interested in, I don't know if I've mentioned this already, because I know I mentioned it before we started the interview, was your YouTube page. I went to check out your YouTube page, which right now only has 2 videos, but I love them and
Yeah,
they're beautiful.
thank you.
And it made me think about, because it's something that I'm playing with too, and because this is a visual platform, getting to explore and seeing different artists' approaches. So how did that come about that you started to make? Because these are like video poems, I would call them, like almost like short films. How did that come about? Was that something that you had a passion for visual art before you started, or how did that come about?
Yeah, so I've always really loved getting to do things at kind of like the intersections, whether that's kind of like the intersections of mediums or the intersection of like art and science. But that's kind of always something that I wanted to do. It was at the back of my mind.
Nice.
Um, but for in 2020, the Canadian Individual Poetry Slam competition, which is usually in Vancouver, it ended up happening online instead.
Mm-hmm.
And because it was online, they kind of they loosen up the rules a lot.
Mm,
So basically, outside of like the usual rules of like, oh, no props, no music, whatever, they basically said you can include any of that.
nice.
So that kind of ended up being a catalyst for me to explore outside of regular slam conventions.
Mm,
So both of the videos on my YouTube channel right now are from the preliminary rounds of
okay.
SIP in 2020. So basically what I did was I looked at like stock footage that was available online under Creative Commons and like music that was available online for free usage. And I was like, okay, how can I use all of this plus my poetry and kind of build a narrative out of it?
Yeah.
Um, and it was really exciting, and I hope to do more of that kind of thing in the future. But that's kind of where that was what really catalyzed it was having this forum where I could do anything with my poetry.
Oh, nice. That's a nice way to kind of I was gonna say it's necessity is the mother of invention came to mind, but it's not exactly. It was more like opportunity to play
Yeah.
was the catalyst there. One of the things I just wanted to mention was you talked about CFSW, so I wanted to let people know that's Canadian Festival of Spoken Word, just in case people wanted to check that out. And I would love to hear another poem if you have another one you wanted to share.
I do have another one. And it's one of the ones that was on my YouTube channel. But I like to perform it with music, so I'm gonna bring my guitar over.
Yay!
Okay, this poem is called Dua for the Weary. My God says, turn everything into an altar. The toilet bowl, the stranger's knees, says there's no indignity in worship. A prayer is still a prayer even if it only finds your lips while you're seized in pain, or need, or quiet desperation says, make a mosque of this body. A prayer is still a prayer even if it only echoes in your limbs rather than over rooftops. My God says, I want for nothing, save your pretenses for each other. A prayer is still a prayer even if it holds no reverence, if it is screamed or begged or sobbed, says, you don't have to want salvation. You can make a cathedral of the waiting room, the bus stop, your cell phone. A prayer, still a prayer even if it is to a forgotten God, or a dying God, or no God at all. My God says, I know you are a burial ground. I carved your mouth into an empty grave, but a prayer is still a prayer even if it is silent. My God says, swallow forgiveness like a river. Show yourself the mercy of an oasis. Whisper love notes into your palms and make wudu. Thank you.
Yay. Wow. Awesome. I'm so glad you did that piece. I actually had a question about that piece. First off,
Okay.
can you tell people where they can find it? Because I think it would be so cool for them to hear this and then go to the print version. Do you remember what the name of the magazine? I forgot now.
It was published in Canthius. I think maybe issue 8.
Oh wait, it was in Canthius.
Yeah, it was in Canthius.
Cool. Okay, cool, awesome. Which is an amazing Canadian magazine. There's a word that you use at the end of that poem. It's the last word. What does that word mean?
Yeah, so the last word in the poem is wudu.
Yeah.
And so this poem, so I have a Muslim upbringing and background, so that informed this poem a lot.
Mm,
And wudu is basically the Muslim process of ablutions. So it's how
okay.
you prepare for prayer,
Mm,
um, or for touching the Quran, for example. So basically you um, there's a whole process, but you run water over your face and your hands, and there's like you'll do it like 3 times for each one. So
mm,
basically, what I'm saying at the end of the poem is to whisper 11 notes in your palms and make wudu,
mm.
um,
Oh,
or like
beautiful.
following that process of cleansing yourself before prayer.
That's beautiful. Wow, I love that. That reminds me of something. I interviewed Ann Simpson and I was talking about cryptic poetry versus more, I guess like straightforward, which tends to be spoken word, less kind of cryptic. But I love too, and I'm glad that because I had a note, and I'm glad I got to ask you about it. That you ended with a word that I didn't know because it brought in. And when I was talking to Ann Simpson, she was saying, I want people to kind of take the poem to the next level, and I had that, oh, I got to know what this word means, which it gives it an opportunity for the poem to really linger, because I can go and do research and then get that fullness of the image that you just shared there and engage in the poem without your presence, really, just me and my own thoughts and the echo of it, whether it's in print or in words. And okay, so I thought I had done all the questions, but I have another question.
No
I
worries.
wanted to, I was curious about, because I noticed this theme of faith, and I'm really, I love poems that engage faith in the work. Is that something that you've always done, or is that is there anything about that in terms of the process or where that comes from that you can share with us?
Sure. So it's kind of ironic because I'm agnostic, but I write a
Oh,
lot
really?
about religion.
Wow.
Yeah, because
Interesting.
it's I find that poetry for me can be like a very spiritual practice.
Hmm.
Um, and I feel like for me and my arts practice, what I'm really hoping to do is kind of reaching, almost like reaching for the sublime and like reaching for kind of like the sense of like transcendent peace,
Yeah,
which I feel like is like this very like spiritual thing.
yeah.
Um, so I feel like that threads through a lot of my work, and just
Mhm.
having that like Muslim background
Mm.
means I have like a lot of those like traditional Muslim influences. Um, and for me, it's also really important that my because I do also write about things like Islamophobia, but I don't want the Muslim influences just to be in the poems where I'm talking about Islamophobia.
Okay, cool.
Like I want them to be in my like gentle and soft poems about my spirituality or any other particular topic. Like I want it to be able to inform any of my work.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, I feel like religion is like, that one. I think I saw a tweet once where someone said something about poets always write about the same three things. Um, religion is definitely one of those for me.
And what were the other two on the list? Love.
Um, yeah, I think religion for me, family maybe,
Hmm.
like
Oh, I
family or
see.
love,
Each person
and
has
then
their
identity.
top
Yeah,
three.
so each person has their own set of three, and religion's definitely up there.
Sorry, I interrupted your last one. So it was family, religion, and
And maybe identity,
okay, cool.
maybe, but yeah, definitely like kind of revolving around those three.
That's an interesting question. Educators, if you're watching this video, ask your students, what are their three things? Um, I think that's true. Sometimes I feel like I'm writing the same poem over and over again, just in different ways.
Yeah.
Um, well, I guess this is the end of our interview. We've come to the end of our time. I really enjoyed talking to you and exploring your work and getting to share that with the Brickyard audience. I'm so happy, and I think of like what a great way to end this series of featuring artists who featured in and were in the collective of Hot Damn. It's a queer slam. Now I'm back to my notes. You can find out more about Hot Damn It's a Queer Slam at queerslam.com. And you have been listening to the wisdom and words of Qurat Dar. And Qurat Dar is on Twitter and Instagram at It's Not Qurat. And it's NOTQUART. And you can check out their YouTube page. I'm not going to, but somebody's going to put the link for that below in the bio. And yeah, please come back and check out more of the offerings here at Brickyard. And I'm going to say the thing that everybody says to like and share and subscribe. But there's a real reason because, this is how we keep this platform going. This is how we support artists and get their work out there. And we're trying to, get to a point where we can be monetized so we can have like less of a precarious existence. So that requires subscribers. And yeah, so please, support the channel and keep an eye out for Qurat and more of their work. And thank you so much, Qurat, for being with us today.
Thank you so much for having me. This was lovely.
Yeah. Yeah, for me too. Okay, I guess that's it. Take care, everybody, Brickyard people, and have a good day. Until next time, take care. Bye bye.